The executive boardroom at Sterling Dynamics fell into stunned silence as Ethan Cooper stepped forward, his custodial uniform a stark contrast to the $1,000 suits surrounding the marble conference table. His pulse thundered as he faced Aubrey Barnes, the 36-year-old tech billionaire, whose empire had revolutionized artificial intelligence across 4 continents. "Don't sign the $12 billion deal," Ethan whispered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Please." Outside, financial reporters waited for the historic acquisition announcement. Inside, Aubrey's manicured hand hovered over the contract. That would merge her company with Nexus Corporation, the largest tech conglomerate in Silicon Valley. Security guards moved toward Ethan, but something in his desperate eyes made her raise her hand, stopping them cold. The single father and former systems architect had exactly 10 seconds before being escorted from the building. What Aubrey Barnes did next would destroy everything Ethan Cooper had fought to rebuild, shattering both their worlds in ways neither could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 42nd floor of Sterling Dynamics felt different at midnight. Gone were the hurried footsteps of software engineers and the constant hum of innovation that made Aubrey Barnes' tech empire the envy of Silicon Valley. In the darkness, only the glow of server farms and distant buildings reminded Ethan Cooper that he was cleaning the offices of one of the most powerful companies on Earth. He moved methodically through the executive wing, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces with the same precision he'd once applied to writing code. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, he'd been debugging systems worth millions. Tonight, he was scrubbing coffee stains from conference tables for $18 an hour. The Sterling Dynamics headquarters rose like a glass cathedral above downtown Austin, its sleek design reflecting Aubrey Barnes' reputation for cutting-edge innovation. Every floor housed teams working on artificial intelligence projects that would reshape industries from healthcare to transportation. Ethan had read about their latest breakthrough in quantum computing integration, work that built upon research he'd pioneered in his previous life. But that was before everything fell apart, before the whistleblowing, before the lawsuits, before 12-year-old Oliver needed a father more than the tech world needed another idealistic systems architect. Ethan paused outside the main boardroom, noticing the lights still blazing inside. Most executives had left hours ago, but through the frosted smart glass walls, he could see a lone figure hunched over documents. He recognized the silhouette immediately, Aubrey Barnes, the prodigious CEO who'd taken a struggling AI startup and transformed it into a $200 billion empire. In just 8 years, the business magazines called her ruthless, brilliant, visionary. The tech blogs debated whether her rapid expansion strategy was genius or recklessness. But watching her work alone at this hour, shoulders tense with the weight of tomorrow's historic decision, Ethan saw something else entirely, someone carrying the kind of burden he remembered all too well. Tomorrow morning, Sterling Dynamics would announce its acquisition by Nexus Corporation for $12 billion. The deal would create the largest AI conglomerate in history, with Aubrey retaining her CEO position while gaining access to Nexus's global infrastructure and government contracts. On paper, it looked like the ultimate victory for a woman who'd fought her way to the top of a male-dominated industry. Ethan checked his watch. 12:47 a.m. Oliver would be fast asleep at their small apartment across town, probably kicked off his covers again despite the Texas heat. Mrs. Rodriguez next door had agreed to listen for him, as she did every night when Ethan worked the graveyard shift. Single parenthood meant accepting help wherever it came, even when pride whispered that he should be the one providing for others, not depending on their kindness. A stack of papers slid from the conference table, followed by Aubrey's frustrated sigh. Professional instinct took over, and Ethan knocked softly on the doorframe. "Excuse me, Ms. Barnes, would you like me to come back later?" Her head snapped up, surprise flashing across features that rarely showed anything but confident control. For a moment, she looked younger than her 36 years, tired, overwhelmed, human. "No, it's fine, come in." Her voice carried the slight edge of someone interrupted mid-thought. "But not UNKINDL, why?" As Ethan entered, Aubrey hastily gathered her documents, several sheets fluttering to the polished floor. He moved to help automatically, bending down to collect the scattered papers. That's when his breath caught in his throat. The documents weren't typical merger paperwork. These were internal Nexus Corporation memos, marked confidential in red letters across every page. His eyes couldn't help but scan the exposed text as he gathered the sheets. Phase 2 implementation, complete integration of Sterling AI algorithms into Nexus defense systems within 90 days of acquisition closure. Project Sentinel, deployment of surveillance capabilities across municipal networks using acquired Sterling technology. Personnel reduction strategy, eliminate redundant R&D positions. Estimated 3,400 employees within first quarter post-merger. Ethan's hands trembled as the implications crashed over him. This wasn't a merger. It was an acquisition designed to weaponize Aubrey's AI innovations for government surveillance programs. Everything Sterling Dynamics had built, every breakthrough they'd achieved in beneficial AI applications, would be perverted into tools for mass data collection and monitoring. The employee termination numbers hit him like a physical blow. 3,400 people. Brilliant minds who dedicated their careers to pushing technology forward, not backward into Orwellian nightmares. Engineers with families, researchers with student loans, support staff like him who'd already learned how quickly a stable life could crumble. "Thank you," Aubrey said, reaching for the papers. But Ethan hesitated, his eyes still fixed on a particularly damning memo outlining plans to integrate Sterling's facial recognition algorithms with domestic surveillance networks. He'd helped develop the foundational code for some of these systems during his tenure at his previous company. He knew exactly how they could be misused. Aubrey followed his gaze, understanding dawning on her face. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. 10 degrees. "That's confidential information," she said, her tone hardening from tired to territorial in seconds. "Of course." "Sorry," Ethan replied, handing over the papers with a deliberately blank expression he'd perfected during his legal battles 3 years ago. The face of someone who'd learned when to see nothing, hear nothing, and definitely say nothing. But as he turned to leave, his mind raced. This was exactly what he'd tried to prevent at his last job, the transformation of beneficial technology into tools of oppression. He'd lost everything trying to stop a similar project, and here it was happening again, on an even larger scale. "You're Ethan, right?" Aubrey called after him. "Night shift maintenance." He paused, surprised she knew his name. In companies this size, custodial staff were usually invisible. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment, something unreadable in her expression. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" Ethan's pulse quickened. If she recognized him from his previous life in tech, if she connected him to the Davidson Systems whistleblowing case. "I don't think so, ma'am. I'd remember meeting you." She nodded slowly, but her eyes remained sharp, analytical. "Good night, then. Good night, Ms. Barnes." Ethan finished his shift on autopilot, his mind churning through what he'd seen. The irony was bitter. He'd taken this job specifically to avoid the moral complexities of high-level tech work, to focus solely on providing stability for Oliver. But the universe seemed determined to place him at the center of ethical storms. He had no power to control. By morning, however, his decision had crystallized. Some battles chose you, whether you wanted them or not. And some secrets were too dangerous to keep, regardless of the personal cost. He'd stayed silent once before to protect his career and family, and it had destroyed him anyway. This time, he'd choose the destruction that came with doing what was right. As dawn broke over Austin's skyline, painting the Sterling Dynamics Tower in shades of gold and amber, Ethan Cooper realized he was about to risk everything again. But this time, it wasn't just about his own conscience. It was about preventing 3,400 families from learning what it felt like when the ground disappeared beneath their feet. The question wasn't whether he'd find the courage to speak up. The question was whether anyone would listen to a night shift janitor who claimed to understand the implications of a $12 billion deal. 6 months earlier, Ethan Cooper had been a different man with a different name in the tech world. As Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper, he'd been the lead systems architect at Davidson Systems, a mid-tier tech company specializing in data analytics and machine learning algorithms. His doctoral dissertation on ethical AI implementation had earned him recognition in academic circles, and his practical applications had made Davidson millions in government contracts. Those had been simpler times, when Oliver was still adjusting to middle school and asking excited questions about Daddy's computer magic. When their suburban home in North Austin felt like a fortress against the world's complexities, and when Ethan's biggest worry was whether Oliver was spending too much time playing video games instead of going outside. The transformation from Dr. Cooper to Ethan the janitor hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow-motion car crash that began with a single classified document and ended with everything he'd built turning to ash. Davidson Systems had landed the contract of a lifetime, developing an AI-powered social media monitoring system for the Department of Homeland Security. On the surface, the project seemed benign, tracking potential terrorist communications and preventing attacks before they materialized. Ethan had initially embraced the work, proud to contribute to national security while advancing the field of predictive analytics. But as the project evolved, so did its scope. What started as monitoring foreign threats gradually expanded to include domestic surveillance capabilities. The AI system Ethan was designing could parse through millions of social media posts, emails, and text messages, identifying not just potential terrorists but political dissidents, journalists, and activists whose only crime was disagreeing with government policies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The breaking point came during a late-night coding session when Ethan discovered hidden subroutines in the system's architecture. Someone had programmed backdoors that would allow the government to monitor any American citizens' digital communications without warrants or oversight. The very safeguards Ethan had built to protect privacy were being systematically dismantled by his own colleagues. When he confronted his supervisor, Dr. Margaret Helsing, about the unauthorized modifications, her response chilled him to the bone. "The Constitution is a luxury we can't afford in the digital age. Ethan, we're building the tools that will keep America safe, even if Americans don't understand what that requires." That night, Ethan sat in Oliver's darkened room watching his son sleep peacefully and made the decision that would destroy everything. He couldn't be part of creating a surveillance state that would inherit the world his boy would grow up in. The next morning, he contacted the Electronic Frontier Foundation and began documenting the illegal surveillance capabilities being built into the Davidson system. For 3 weeks, he lived a double life, dutiful employee by day, secret whistleblower by night. He copied files, recorded conversations, and gathered evidence that would eventually expose one of the largest domestic surveillance programs in U.S. history. When the story broke in the Washington Post, the fallout was swift and devastating. Davidson Systems immediately terminated Ethan's employment and filed criminal charges for corporate espionage and theft of trade secrets. The Department of Homeland Security launched its own investigation, freezing his assets and placing him under surveillance. His security clearance was revoked, making him unemployable in any tech company with government contracts. The legal battles consumed his savings within months. High-powered corporate attorneys systematically demolished his reputation, painting him as a disgruntled employee seeking attention and financial gain. They argued that his actions had endangered national security and cost taxpayers millions in wasted development funds. Oliver, meanwhile, watched his father's world crumble with the helpless confusion of a 12-year-old trying to understand why Daddy couldn't go to work anymore, why strangers with cameras waited outside their house, and why they had to move from their comfortable suburban home to a cramped apartment on the other side of town. The worst part wasn't the financial destruction, or even the character assassination in the media. It was the isolation. Former colleagues stopped returning his calls. Academic contacts disappeared from his network. The tech community that had once celebrated his innovations now treated him like a pariah who'd violated the unspoken code of corporate loyalty. Dr. Margaret Helsing had been particularly vindictive in her testimony against him, claiming that Ethan had always been unstable and prone to paranoid delusions about government overreach. She suggested that his divorce 2 years earlier, when Oliver's mother had chosen her career in London over their family, had left him emotionally compromised and seeking someone to blame for his personal failures. The irony was brutal. Ethan had blown the whistle to protect democratic freedoms, but the legal system he'd trusted to vindicate him instead became another tool of his destruction. Federal prosecutors eventually declined to file criminal charges, acknowledging that the surveillance program had indeed violated constitutional protections. But by then, the damage was complete. The civil lawsuits from Davidson Systems dragged on for 18 months, bleeding away what remained of his resources. His lawyer, initially confident about their chances, began pushing for settlement as corporate attorneys filed motion after motion designed to exhaust Ethan's ability to fight. The message was clear: even when you're right, challenging powerful interests comes with a price few people can afford to pay. When the dust finally settled, Ethan had technically won. The surveillance program was shut down, new oversight protocols were implemented, and several Davidson executives faced congressional hearings. But his victory was Pyrrhic. He was broke, unemployable in his field, and struggling to maintain custody of Oliver while dealing with his own depression and PTSD from the legal warfare. The transition to custodial work had been humbling, but necessary. Oliver needed stability, health insurance, and a father who could be present for school events instead of trapped in conference rooms with lawyers. Ethan swallowed his pride and applied for jobs that would keep them housed and fed, even if they didn't utilize his doctoral degree in computer science. Sterling Dynamics had hired him without a background check sophisticated enough to connect Ethan Cooper with Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper. He'd legally shortened his name during the bankruptcy proceedings, partly for privacy and partly because he needed to psychologically separate his past from his present. The brilliant systems architect was gone. In his place was a single father, focused solely on providing for his son. Working nights allowed Ethan to be available when Oliver got home from school, to help with homework and attend parent-teacher conferences. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was honest work that didn't require him to compromise his values or contribute to systems that might harm innocent people. Or so he'd thought, until last night's discovery in Aubrey Barnes' boardroom, standing in their small apartment kitchen that morning, making Oliver's lunch for school. Ethan felt the familiar weight of moral responsibility settling on his shoulders. The Nexus Corporation documents had revealed a surveillance system that made his Davidson Systems project look primitive by comparison. Sterling Dynamics AI technology, once deployed through Nexus's infrastructure, would create an unprecedented ability to monitor and analyze human behavior on a global scale. "Dad, you look tired," Oliver observed, appearing in the kitchen doorway in his school uniform. At 12, he developed an unsettling ability to read his father's moods, a skill born from watching too many adult conversations from the shadows. "Just thinking about work stuff, buddy. Nothing for you to worry about." But even as he said it, Ethan knew he was lying. Oliver would inherit whatever world the adults around him chose to build. And right now, those adults were about to sign a $12 billion deal that would fundamentally alter the relationship between technology and human freedom. The question haunting Ethan as he watched his son head off to school was whether he had any fight left in him. The last time he'd chosen principle over security, it had cost them everything. This time, the stakes were even higher, not just for their family, but for everyone who would live in a world where artificial intelligence could watch their every move. As Oliver's school bus disappeared around the corner, Ethan Cooper made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He was going to have to become Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper one more time, whether the world wanted to hear from him or not. The alarm on Ethan's phone buzzed at 3:47 p.m., pulling him from the restless sleep that had become his norm since taking the night shift at Sterling Dynamics. 6 hours of sleep was manageable when his mind wasn't racing with the implications of classified documents and billion-dollar conspiracies. But last night had offered no such luxury. He rolled out of bed in the cramped master bedroom of their two-bedroom apartment, rubbing his eyes as afternoon sunlight filtered through blinds that had come with the place, the kind that never quite closed properly and let in just enough light to make daytime sleep a challenge. The apartment complex, Meridian Gardens, was a generous name for a collection of aging buildings where young families and single parents scraped together enough for rent in Austin's increasingly expensive housing market. Oliver would be home from Jefferson Middle School in 20 minutes, and Ethan had learned to treasure these few hours they had together each weekday. It was the only time that felt normal anymore. Homework at the kitchen table, dinner preparations, conversations about teachers and friends, and all the mundane concerns of a 12-year-old navigating 7th grade. The apartment showed the careful organization of someone stretching every dollar. Generic cereal boxes lined the top shelf of their small pantry, and the refrigerator was stocked with sale items and bulk purchases from the discount grocery store across town. Ethan had become an expert at stretching ground beef into multiple meals and finding creative ways to make boxed mac and cheese feel like a treat rather than a necessity. On the kitchen counter sat a stack of medical bills from Oliver's emergency room visit 3 months ago, when a severe asthma attack had sent them racing to Dell Children's Medical Center at 2 a.m. Even with their basic health insurance, the deductible and copays had created a $2,400 debt that Ethan was paying off at $100 per month. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd once earned more in a single day than he now made in 2 weeks. The front door burst open with the distinctive sound of Oliver's backpack hitting the floor, followed by his breathless voice. "Dad, you awake?" "In the kitchen, buddy. How was school?" Oliver appeared in the doorway, his sandy brown hair disheveled from the Texas heat, and his school uniform wrinkled in the way that suggested he'd spent lunch period actually playing outside instead of staring at a phone screen. At 12, he'd inherited his father's analytical mind, but thankfully not his tendency toward brooding. "Miss Patterson wants to talk to you about the science fair," Oliver announced, digging through the refrigerator with the focused intensity of a growing adolescent. "She thinks I should enter my AI project." Ethan's chest tightened. Oliver's science fair project was a simple chatbot he'd programmed using tutorials from YouTube and a coding platform designed for kids. It was impressive work for a 7th grader, showing the same intuitive understanding of systems that had once made Ethan a rising star in the tech world. But watching his son gravitate toward artificial intelligence felt like watching him walk toward a cliff edge. "That's great, Oliver. What did you tell her?" "I said I'd ask you first. She wants to know if you could help me make it more advanced." She said ... double quotes. Oliver paused, suddenly looking uncertain. "She said she could tell I had help from someone who really understands programming. I told her you used to work with computers, but I didn't know how much to say." The careful balance of their new life crystallized in that moment. Ethan had deliberately kept his professional background vague when talking to Oliver's teachers and classmates' parents. Daddy used to work with computers was easier than explaining why Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper now cleaned office buildings for minimum wage. But Oliver was getting old enough to sense the gaps in the story, smart enough to wonder why his father's computer knowledge seemed so sophisticated for someone who'd supposedly worked in tech support. "We can definitely work on making your project better," Ethan said carefully. "But let's focus on what you want to learn, not on impressing the judges." Oliver nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why don't you work with computers anymore? I mean, you know more about programming than any of my friends' parents who work for Apple or Google. Marcus's dad is a software engineer, and he couldn't even help Marcus with basic HTML. The question Ethan had been dreading, delivered with the guileless directness that made 12-year-olds such formidable interrogators. He sat down at their small kitchen table, gesturing for Oliver to join him. "Sometimes, adults have to make difficult choices about what kind of work they want to do," Ethan began. "I used to work for a company that asked me to build things I didn't think were right. When I said no, it made it hard for me to find other jobs doing the same kind of work." "What kind of things?" "Computer programs that could spy on people without them knowing. I thought that was wrong, so I tried to stop it from happening." Oliver processed this with the seriousness he'd learned to apply to adult conversations. "And they fired you for that?" "They did more than fire me. They tried to make sure I couldn't get another job anywhere else. That's why we moved to this apartment, and why I work at night now. But you did the right thing." "I tried to. Sometimes doing the right thing is expensive." Oliver was quiet for a moment, absently rotating his water glass on the table. "Is that why you always tell me to stand up to bullies, even when it's scary?" The simple connection hit Ethan harder than he'd expected. "Yeah, buddy, that's exactly why." They worked on homework together for the next hour, Oliver attacking his algebra problems with the same systematic approach he brought to everything else. Ethan found himself marveling at his son's resilience, how quickly Oliver had adapted to their reduced circumstances, how rarely he complained about the things they couldn't afford, how naturally he'd taken on additional responsibilities around the apartment. When Oliver struggled with a particularly complex word problem, Ethan guided him through breaking it down into smaller components, identifying variables and relationships. It was the same analytical framework he'd once applied to million-dollar software architectures, now repurposed for 7th grade mathematics. "You're really good at explaining things," Oliver observed. "You should be a teacher." "Maybe someday," Ethan replied, though they both knew teachers' salaries wouldn't cover their current expenses, much less pay down the debt still hanging over them from the legal battles. As evening approached, Ethan began preparing for another night shift, the weight of what he'd discovered in Aubrey Barnes' boardroom settling back onto his shoulders. The Nexus Corporation documents represented exactly the kind of technological overreach he'd sacrificed everything to prevent. But this time, the stakes were exponentially higher. A $12 billion deal that would create surveillance capabilities beyond anything governments had previously possessed. "Dad?" Oliver's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you worried about something?" Ethan paused in gathering his work uniform. Oliver had inherited more than his analytical mind. He'd also developed an uncanny ability to sense when his father's thoughts were elsewhere. "Just thinking about some things I learned at work. Nothing for you to worry about." "Is someone doing something wrong again?" The perceptiveness of the question stopped Ethan cold. "What makes you ask that?" "You get the same look on your face that you had before we moved here. Like you're trying to figure out how to fix something that other people don't want fixed." In that moment, Ethan realized how much his son had absorbed from their previous crisis, how carefully Oliver had been watching and learning from his father's struggles with conscience and consequence. The 12-year-old sitting across from him had already learned Lessons about integrity and sacrifice that most adults never faced. If I had to choose between doing something right and keeping us safe, what would you want me to do? Ethan asked. Quietly, Oliver's answer came without hesitation. The right thing. We'll figure out the rest together. The simple faith in his son's voice nearly broke Ethan's heart. Oliver trusted him to make the difficult choices, trusted that they could weather whatever storms those choices might bring. It was a responsibility that felt simultaneously overwhelming and clarifying. As Ethan prepared to leave for Sterling Dynamics, he looked around their modest apartment, at the medical bills on the counter, the generic groceries in the pantry, the second-hand furniture they'd assembled piece by piece. It wasn't much, but it was honest. It was built on work that didn't require him to compromise his values or contribute to systems that could harm innocent people. But now those systems had found him anyway, in the form of classified documents that revealed a surveillance apparatus, more comprehensive than anything he'd fought against before. The question wasn't whether he had a moral obligation to act. That much was clear. The question was whether he had any power to influence events, or whether a night shift janitor's warnings would simply be dismissed as the paranoid ravings of someone with a documented history of instability. As he kissed Oliver goodnight and headed out into the Texas evening, Ethan carried with him the memory of his son's unwavering faith in doing the right thing. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let Oliver inherit a world where that faith was naive rather than noble. The Sterling Dynamics Tower rose before him like a monument to human ambition and technological progress. Tonight, somewhere in that gleaming structure, Aubrey Barnes was probably making final preparations for tomorrow's historic announcement. She had no idea that a janitor who'd once been Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper was about to risk everything again to save her from making the biggest mistake of her career. Ethan arrived at Sterling Dynamics an hour early for his shift, using his keycard to access the building through the employee entrance in the parking garage. The security guard, Raymond, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. After 6 months, Ethan had become part of the invisible infrastructure that kept the building functioning while the real work happened elsewhere. Evening, Ethan. Quiet night ahead, I think. Most of the executives cleared out around 5 for some big dinner. Thanks, Raymond. I'll try to stay out of your way. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor gave Ethan time to center himself and review his plan. He needed to understand the full scope of the Nexus Corporation deal before tomorrow morning's announcement. The documents he'd glimpsed in Aubrey Barnes' office had shown only fragments of a larger picture, but those fragments suggested something far more sinister than a simple corporate acquisition. The executive floor was eerily quiet. Emergency lighting, casting long shadows across the polished corridors. Ethan began his cleaning routine methodically, but his real attention was focused on gathering intelligence. Corporate mergers of this magnitude generated massive amounts of documentation. Legal briefs, financial projections, technical specifications, regulatory filings. If he could access even a fraction of that paperwork, he might be able to piece together the true nature of the deal. His first stop was the copy center adjacent to the main boardroom. Corporate printers often retained cached copies of recent documents, and Ethan had learned enough about network systems during his previous career to navigate basic file recovery. The Sterling Dynamics IT department used standard security protocols that had remained unchanged since his hiring, adequate for preventing external intrusions, but vulnerable to someone with legitimate building access and insider knowledge. 20 minutes later, he'd recovered 17 documents from the printer's memory cache, each one marked with various levels of confidentiality warnings. The papers painted a picture that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. The Nexus Corporation wasn't just acquiring Sterling Dynamics, artificial intelligence technology. They were specifically targeting Aubrey's breakthrough work in behavioral prediction algorithms. Her team had developed AI systems capable of analyzing massive datasets to predict human behavior patterns with unprecedented accuracy. Originally designed for benevolent applications like predicting disease outbreaks or optimizing traffic flow, the technology had attracted attention from entities with far darker intentions. According to the internal memos, Nexus had been operating as a front company for a consortium of government agencies and private military contractors. Their commercial AI applications were actually beta tests for surveillance and social control systems designed to monitor and influence civilian populations. The $12 billion acquisition of Sterling Dynamics would give them access to Aubrey's algorithms, which they planned to integrate with existing data collection networks operated by major tech platforms. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the technical specifications. The combined system would be capable of tracking individual citizens across multiple platforms, predicting their political affiliations, identifying potential dissidents, and even suggesting intervention strategies to modify behavior before it became problematic. It was the surveillance state he'd tried to prevent at Davidson Systems, amplified by orders of magnitude and wrapped in the legitimacy of a major corporate acquisition. One document, marked Classified Operation Mirror, detailed the pilot program's scope. Major cities including Austin, Seattle, Denver, and Phoenix would serve as testing grounds for the integrated surveillance system. Citizens' social media activity, purchasing patterns, location data, and even biometric information from security cameras would feed into Aubrey's algorithms, creating comprehensive behavioral profiles for every person within the monitored areas. The most chilling aspect was the system's predictive capabilities. Rather than simply monitoring behavior, the AI would identify individuals likely to engage in antisocial activities, a category that included everything from violent crime to political protest to journalism that criticized government policies. Those individuals would then be subjected to targeted intervention strategies, social media manipulation, economic pressure through credit score adjustments, or direct harassment by law enforcement. Ethan recognized elements of his own work in the technical specifications. The behavioral modeling techniques he'd developed for Davidson Systems had apparently been reverse engineered and incorporated into this larger project. His attempts to prevent government surveillance had simply delayed its implementation, not stopped it. The very algorithms he'd tried to protect were now being weaponized on a scale he'd never imagined. A noise in the corridor froze him mid-thought. Footsteps approaching the copy center. Too early for other custodial staff, and too late for executives. Ethan quickly gathered the documents, stuffing them into his cleaning cart beneath a pile of industrial paper towels, and began wiping down the printer with practiced nonchalance. Evening. The voice belonged to James Morrison, Sterling Dynamics Chief Technology Officer and Aubrey's second-in-command. A thin man in his 50s with graying hair and the pallor of someone who spent too much time staring at computer screens. Good evening, sir. Just finishing up the printers. I can come back later if you need to use them. Morrison studied him with calculating eyes. You're new, aren't you? I haven't seen you on this floor before. About 6 months, sir. Usually work the lower floors, but they asked me to cover up here tonight. What's your name? Ethan Cooper. Sir. Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Cooper, interesting. You know, we ran enhanced background checks on all custodial staff last week, given tomorrow's announcement. Your file came back with some unusual flags. Ethan's pulse accelerated, but he maintained his neutral expression. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper, formerly of Davidson Systems. You thought changing your name and cutting your hair would be enough to hide your identity? The careful life Ethan had built over the past 6 months collapsed in an instant. Morrison knew exactly who he was, which meant other people in the company likely knew as well. The question was, how long they'd known, and what they planned to do about it. I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I think you have me confused with someone else. Morrison smiled coldly. The same Dr. Cooper who cost the Department of Homeland Security $40 million in wasted development costs. Who leaked classified information to journalists and nearly triggered a congressional investigation into surveillance programs. Sir, I really think you have the wrong person. Do I? Because it seems like quite a coincidence that a former systems architect specializing in surveillance technology would end up working the night shift in the same building where we're finalizing the largest AI acquisition in corporate history. Ethan realized that maintaining his cover was no longer possible. Morrison's tone suggested this wasn't a chance encounter. He'd been specifically looking for him, which meant Ethan's presence at Sterling Dynamics had been discovered and flagged as a security concern. What do you want? Ethan asked quietly. I want to know why a discredited whistleblower is cleaning our offices 12 hours before we announce a deal that will revolutionize artificial intelligence applications. I want to know what you've seen, what you've copied, and who you're planning to share it with. I'm here because I need a job that pays enough to support my son. Nothing more complicated than that. Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Dr. Cooper, you have no idea how much bigger this is than your little Davidson Systems adventure. The work we're doing here will reshape society in ways that make your previous concerns look quaint. You can either be part of it or be crushed by it, but you cannot stop it. What are you talking about? Tomorrow morning, Aubrey Barnes will sign a deal that transfers her AI technology to organizations with the resources and vision to implement it properly. We're not building surveillance systems, Dr. Cooper. We're building social optimization platforms that will eliminate crime, terrorism, and political instability before they can manifest. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what Morrison was describing, a totalitarian control system dressed up as public safety innovation. Ethan had heard similar justifications from his former supervisors at Davidson Systems, but this was several steps beyond anything they'd envisioned. And if people don't want to be optimized? Morrison's smile turned predatory. People want safety, Dr. Cooper. They want their children to be safe from terrorists, their neighborhoods to be safe from criminals, their society to be stable and prosperous. What they don't want is to understand the technical details of how that safety is maintained. You're talking about eliminating human freedom. I'm talking about eliminating human suffering. The chaos and unpredictability that you call freedom has given us school shootings, political extremism, and social media radicalization. Our AI systems will identify and neutralize those threats before they can cause harm. Ethan understood now why Morrison was having this conversation instead of simply calling security. They wanted to know how much he'd discovered and whether he posed a genuine threat to tomorrow's announcement. But they also seemed to believe they could convince him to join their cause rather than oppose it. What makes you think Aubrey Barnes knows what her technology will really be used for? Morrison's expression shifted slightly, suggesting Ethan had hit a sensitive point. Miss Barnes is a brilliant technologist, but she's naive about the realities of implementation at scale. She believes her algorithms will be used for benevolent purposes because that's what she wants to believe. We haven't corrected that misconception because it would be counterproductive. You're lying to her. We're protecting her from information that would compromise her ability to focus on the technical aspects of the transition. She understands the larger vision once the integration is complete. The casual admission of deception confirmed Ethan's worst fears. Aubrey Barnes was about to sign away her life's work without understanding its true implications, and the people she trusted were deliberately keeping her in the dark about the surveillance state they planned to build with her innovations. Morrison checked his watch. This conversation has been illuminating, Dr. Cooper, but it's time for you to make a choice. You can finish your shift, collect your paycheck, and forget everything you think you've learned. Or you can repeat your Davidson Systems performance and find yourself facing federal charges for corporate espionage and violation of national security statutes. And if I choose option 3, there is no option 3. The deal will be signed tomorrow morning whether you approve or not. The only variable is whether you'll be free to watch it happen from your apartment or from a federal detention facility. As Morrison walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his racing thoughts and stolen documents, the magnitude of his situation crystallized. He'd stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that made his previous whistleblowing efforts look like minor corporate disputes. The surveillance state he'd tried to prevent was about to be implemented with unprecedented scope and sophistication, using technology created by someone who had no idea what she was enabling. The question now wasn't whether he had a moral obligation to act, that was clear. The question was whether he could find a way to reach Aubrey Barnes before tomorrow morning's signing, and whether she would believe a disgraced janitor's warnings about the people she trusted with her life's work. In his cleaning cart, beneath industrial paper towels, sat 17 documents that could prevent the largest expansion of government surveillance in human history. But first, he had to survive the night and find a way to get them to the one person who still had the power to stop what was coming. Ethan finished his shift in a haze of adrenaline and dread, Morrison's threats echoing in his mind as he mechanically emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces. The CTO's words had made one thing clear: Sterling Dynamics knew exactly who he was, and they'd been watching him far longer than he'd realized. The question that tormented him during the endless hours until dawn was whether their surveillance extended beyond the workplace. By 6 a.m., Ethan was racing through Austin's morning traffic toward Oliver's school, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He'd tried calling Mrs. Rodriguez 3 times during his drive home, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Their neighbor was an early riser who always answered her phone. Her silence felt ominous in ways that rational thought couldn't dismiss. Jefferson Middle School's parking lot was nearly empty when Ethan arrived, only a few cars belonging to teachers preparing for the day ahead. He badged in through the main office, where the secretary recognized him from previous parent conferences. "Mr. Cooper? Is everything all right? Oliver's not in any trouble, is he? I need to speak with him urgently. Family emergency." 10 minutes later, Oliver appeared in the main office doorway, his face creased with worry. At 12, he'd learned to read the signs of adult crisis with unsettling accuracy. "Dad? What's wrong? You look terrible." Ethan pulled his son aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Oliver, I need you to listen carefully. I think we might be in danger because of something I discovered at work. I'm going to take you somewhere safe while I figure out what to do." "Danger? From who?" "The people I work for. They're not who they pretend to be, and they're planning something that could hurt a lot of innocent people. When I tried to stop them before, they made our lives very difficult. This time might be worse." Oliver's expression shifted from confusion to the kind of serious determination that reminded Ethan painfully of his own childhood. "What do you need me to do?" "Pack a bag with clothes for a few days. We're going to stay with your Aunt Sarah in Dallas until I can sort this out." Sarah Mitchell, Ethan's sister, was a high school science teacher who lived in a quiet suburb north of Dallas. She'd offered them refuge during the worst of the Davidson Systems fallout, and Ethan trusted her to keep Oliver safe while he dealt with whatever was coming. As they drove back to their apartment, Ethan tried calling Mrs. Rodriguez again. This time, a man answered, someone he didn't recognize. "Rodriguez residence. This is Ethan Cooper from next door. Is Mrs. Rodriguez available?" "I'm afraid Mrs. Rodriguez isn't taking calls right now. Perhaps you could leave a message?" The careful phrasing and unfamiliar voice sent ice through Ethan's veins. Mrs. Rodriguez lived alone and never had male visitors. Especially not at 7 a.m. on a weekday. Who is this? A friend of the family. I let her know you called. The line went dead. Ethan immediately tried Mrs. Rodriguez's cell phone, but it too went straight to voicemail. Whatever was happening, it had started faster than he'd anticipated. At their apartment complex, everything appeared normal. No suspicious vehicles, no obvious surveillance. But Ethan's paranoia had been honed by his previous experience with corporate retaliation, and he noticed details that might have escaped civilian attention. A utility van parked across the street that hadn't been there when he left for work. A maintenance worker who seemed more interested in observing than repairing. "Dad, you're scaring me," Oliver said quietly as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. "I know, buddy, I'm scared too. But we're going to be smart about this, and we're going to be safe." Inside their apartment, Ethan moved with practiced efficiency, gathering essential documents and clothes while Oliver packed his school backpack with favorite books and his laptop. The normalcy of their home felt fragile, temporary, a life they were about to abandon for the second time in 3 years. As Oliver folded clothes into his duffel bag, he asked the question Ethan had been dreading. "Is this like when we had to move before? When you tried to stop the bad people at your old job?" "Yes and no. This is bigger, Oliver. Much bigger. The people I worked for before wanted to spy on Americans. The people at my current job want to control them." "Control them? How?" Ethan paused in his packing, trying to find age-appropriate language for a totalitarian surveillance state. "Imagine if someone could watch everything you did, everywhere you went, everyone you talked to. And then imagine they used that information to decide what jobs you could have, what schools you could attend, even who you were allowed to be friends with." Oliver's eyes widened with understanding. "Like China?" "Exactly like China, but using technology that's much more advanced. And the woman who created that technology doesn't know what it's really going to be used for. So you have to warn her." The simple clarity of his son's moral reasoning cut through Ethan's confusion and fear. "Yes, I have to warn her, even though it might get us in trouble again?" "Even though." Oliver nodded with the solemnity of someone far older than 12. "Then we better hurry." As they loaded their bags into Ethan's aging Honda Civic, his phone rang. An unknown number with a local area code. "Mr. Cooper? This is Detective Maria Santos with the Austin Police Department. I need to speak with you about a disturbance at the Meridian Gardens apartment complex." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What kind of disturbance?" "There was a break-in at your neighbor's apartment early this morning. Mrs. Rodriguez is in the hospital with injuries sustained during the incident. She asked specifically that we contact you." "Is she going to be okay?" "She's stable, but she wanted to pass along a message. She said to tell you that they were asking about Oliver. Does that mean anything to you?" The message hit Ethan like a physical blow. They hadn't just been watching him, they'd identified Oliver as leverage, a way to ensure his compliance. Mrs. Rodriguez had been hurt because she'd tried to protect information about his son. "Detective Santos, I think my family may be in danger. Can you provide police protection?" "Mr. Cooper, I need you to come down to the station so we can discuss this properly. Can you be here within the hour?" Ethan recognized the careful phrasing of someone following a script. Whether Detective Santos was genuinely trying to help or had been compromised, he couldn't risk trusting official channels. The same government agencies that had persecuted him over Davidson Systems were likely involved in the Sterling Dynamics operation. "I'll be there as soon as possible," he lied, already planning their route to Dallas. As they drove away from their apartment complex, Oliver asked quietly, "Are we ever going to be able to go home?" "I don't know, buddy. I hope so. Will Mrs. Rodriguez be okay?" "I think so. She's tougher than she looks." They drove in silence for several miles before Oliver spoke again. "Dad, why do people do these things? Why do they want to hurt innocent people?" It was the question that had tormented Ethan since his first encounter with government overreach. Because they're scared, Oliver. They're scared of losing control, scared of people making choices they don't approve of. So they convince themselves that taking away everyone's freedom is actually protecting them. But you're not scared of letting people make their own choices. I'm terrified of it sometimes. But I'm more scared of what happens when someone else gets to make all the choices. For everyone. As Austin's skyline receded in their rearview mirror, Ethan felt the familiar weight of moral obligation settling on his shoulders. Mrs. Rodriguez was in the hospital because he discovered information that powerful people wanted to keep secret. Oliver was in danger because Ethan had chosen to pursue that information instead of ignoring it. But somewhere in Austin, Aubrey Barnes was probably reviewing final documents for a signing ceremony that would begin in less than 6 hours. She had no idea that her life's work was about to be weaponized against innocent people, or that the colleagues she trusted were systematically deceiving her about the deal's true nature. The 17 documents hidden in Ethan's overnight bag represented her only chance to understand what she was really signing. But getting those documents to her would require him to return to Sterling Dynamics, where Morrison and his allies were waiting for him. Dad? Oliver's voice pulled him back to the present. When we get to Aunt Sarah's, are you going to leave me there and go back? The perceptiveness of the question shouldn't have surprised him. Oliver had watched his father wrestle with similar moral dilemmas before, had seen him choose principle over security despite the personal cost. I might have. 2. Because someone has to warn the lady about what's really happening. Because someone has to try. Oliver was quiet for a moment, staring out at the Texas landscape rolling past their windows. I know you have to go back. I just want you to be careful. I will be. And Dad? When this is over, do you think we'll be able to have a normal life? Like other families? The question broke Ethan's heart because he didn't know the answer. Twice now, his attempts to do the right thing had upended their lives and put Oliver in danger. But the alternative, staying silent while surveillance states expanded their power, felt like betraying everything he wanted his son to believe about justice and moral courage. I hope so, buddy. I really hope so. As they approached the outskirts of Dallas, Ethan made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would get Oliver to safety with Sarah, then return to Austin for one final confrontation with the people who thought they could purchase human freedom for $12 billion. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. If he drove through the night, he could reach Sterling Dynamics by dawn, giving him just enough time to find Aubrey Barnes and show her the documents that would expose the truth about her deal with Nexus Corporation, whether she would believe a disgraced janitor's warnings, whether she would have the courage to walk away from $12 billion, whether any of them would survive what came next. Those were questions he couldn't answer, but Mrs. Rodriguez was in the hospital because she'd tried to protect Oliver from people who viewed 12-year-old boys as acceptable collateral damage in their quest for social control. That made it personal in ways that transcended professional obligation or moral duty. Some battles chose you, regardless of whether you felt ready to fight them. And this time, Ethan Cooper was going to make sure he chose his ground. Sarah Mitchell lived in a modest ranch house in Plano, surrounded by the kind of suburban normalcy that Ethan hadn't experienced since his previous life as Dr. Cooper. Her driveway was bordered by carefully maintained flower beds, and her front porch featured a swing where she graded papers on weekend mornings. It was exactly the safe haven Oliver needed while his father confronted the most dangerous people he'd ever encountered. Sarah answered the door in her pajamas and immediately pulled both of them into a fierce hug. At 41, she was 3 years younger than Ethan, but had always been the more pragmatic sibling. Her response to their unannounced arrival was characteristically direct. How bad is it this time? Worse than Davidson Systems, Ethan admitted as they settled in her living room. They heard an innocent woman to send me a message about Oliver. This isn't just about destroying my career anymore." Sarah listened without interruption as Ethan explained the Sterling Dynamics situation, the Nexus Corporation conspiracy, and Morrison's threats. Her expression grew increasingly grim as the scope of the surveillance system became clear. "So you're planning to walk into a boardroom full of billionaires and convince them to abandon a $12 billion deal based on documents you stole while working as a janitor. When you put it like that, it sounds insane." Because it is. Insane, Ethan. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to use violence to protect their interests. What makes you think they won't just have you arrested the moment you show your face? Oliver had been listening from the kitchen doorway, and now he stepped forward with the kind of determination that reminded both adults how much he'd matured over the past 3 years. "Because someone has to try," he said quietly. "Dad always tells me that doing the right thing isn't about whether you'll succeed. It's about whether you can live with yourself if you don't try." Sarah looked between her nephew and her brother, recognizing the family stubbornness that had gotten Ethan into trouble before. "Oliver, sweetheart, why don't you go get settled in the guest room while your dad and I talk?" When they were alone, Sarah's teacher instincts took over. "Ethan, you have a responsibility to your son that goes beyond whatever moral obligation you feel toward Aubrey Barnes. Oliver's already lost one parent. Are you really willing to risk making him an orphan for the sake of strangers?" The question hit harder than any of Morrison's threats. Ethan's ex-wife, Oliver's mother, had chosen her career advancement in London over their family, leaving their son with abandonment issues that still surface during stressful periods. If something happened to Ethan, Oliver would be truly alone, except for Sarah's support. "What kind of world am I leaving him if I let this happen?" Ethan countered. "The surveillance system they're building will monitor every aspect of his life. Every friend he makes, every book he reads, every opinion he forms. All of it will be analyzed and potentially used against him by algorithms designed to ensure compliance. You don't know that for certain. You're making assumptions based on limited information." Ethan pulled out his phone and showed her photos of the documents he'd discovered. "These aren't assumptions, Sarah. This is their actual implementation plan. They're going to test the system in 4 cities initially, then expand it nationwide within 18 months. By the time Oliver graduates high school, he'll be living in a society where artificial intelligence decides what opportunities he's allowed to pursue." Sarah studied the documents, her expression shifting as she grasped the technical implications. As a science teacher, she understood enough about data analysis and behavioral modeling to recognize the dystopian potential of what Ethan was describing. Even if you're right about the threat, what makes you think you can stop it? You tried to blow the whistle before, and they destroyed you. This time, the stakes are even higher. This time, I'm not trying to expose them after the fact. I'm trying to prevent Aubrey Barnes from signing the deal in the first place. If she understands what her technology will really be used for, she might walk away. And if she doesn't..." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring out Sarah's living room window at the peaceful suburban street where children would soon be riding bikes and playing games, oblivious to the surveillance apparatus being constructed around them. "Then at least I'll know I tried everything I could." Sarah recognized the finality in his voice, the same tone he'd used 3 years ago when he decided to contact the Electronic Frontier Foundation about Davidson Systems. Her brother had always been driven by an almost compulsive need to protect people from technological overreach, even when that protection came at enormous personal cost. "What do you need from me?" "Keep Oliver safe. If something goes wrong, if I don't come back, make sure he knows why I had to try." "You're coming back." "Ethan, we're not having this conversation." They spent the next hour developing contingency plans. Sarah would keep Oliver home from school and avoid any public places where they might be tracked. If Ethan didn't contact her by noon, she would drive Oliver to their cousin in Houston and wait for further instructions. If he didn't contact her within 48 hours, she would assume the worst and begin the process of applying for legal guardianship. As Ethan prepared to leave, Oliver appeared with his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. "I want to help." "Absolutely not. You're staying here where it's safe." "Dad, I've been thinking about what you told me. About how they want to control people using artificial intelligence. I know more about programming than most adults, and I understand how these systems work. Oliver, this isn't a science fair project. These are dangerous people who've already hurt someone to get to me. Which is exactly why you need all the help you can get. I can analyze their code, identify vulnerabilities, maybe even find ways to disrupt their systems remotely." Sarah intervened before the argument could escalate. "Oliver, your father is trying to protect you. The best way you can help him is by staying safe and letting him focus on stopping these people without worrying about your safety." Oliver's expression showed the frustration of someone old enough to understand the stakes, but young enough to be excluded from adult decisions. "Promise me you'll be careful, Dad. Promise me you won't do anything stupid just because you think it's noble." "I promise I'll be as careful as I can while still doing what needs to be done." "That's not the same thing. It's the best I can offer." As Ethan drove away from Sarah's house, heading back toward Austin through the pre-dawn darkness, he carried with him the weight of his son's trust and his sister's fears. The Honda's radio provided background noise, but his thoughts were consumed by the documents in his passenger seat and the woman who needed to see them before making the biggest mistake of her career. The Sterling Dynamics signing ceremony was scheduled to begin in 5 hours. Aubrey Barnes would arrive at her office around 8 a.m. to review final paperwork, giving Ethan a narrow window to reach her before the boardroom filled with Nexus corporation executives and their hidden allies. His plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Intercept Aubrey before the ceremony, show her the classified documents, and hope that her moral compass was stronger than her business ambitions. If she refused to listen or dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a disgruntled employee, the surveillance state would launch as scheduled. If she believed him but lacked the courage to walk away from $12 billion, the outcome would be the same. If she tried to expose the conspiracy and was overruled by her board, Nexus Corporation would simply find another technology company to acquire. Perhaps one whose leadership was more amenable to their true agenda. The only scenario that prevented the surveillance systems implementation required Aubrey Barnes to not only believe Ethan's warnings but also possess the moral courage to sacrifice her company's financial future for the sake of preserving human freedom. It was a lot to ask of someone he'd never had a real conversation with, someone who knew him only as the night shift janitor who occasionally emptied her trash. As Austin's skyline appeared on the horizon, illuminated by the rising sun, Ethan thought about Oliver's faith in doing the right thing regardless of the consequences. His son had inherited more than his analytical mind. He'd also absorbed the fundamental conviction that some principles were worth defending, even when the cost was prohibitive. Mrs. Rodriguez was in the hospital because she'd tried to protect a 12-year-old boy from people who viewed children as acceptable leverage in their quest for social control. Oliver was hidden in Dallas because his father had stumbled onto information that powerful interests wanted to suppress. Somewhere in Austin, Aubrey Barnes was preparing to sign documents that would fundamentally alter the relationship between technology and human freedom. The decision was no longer about whether Ethan Cooper could live with the consequences of inaction. It was about whether Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper had learned anything from his previous failures, and whether he could find a way to succeed where principled opposition had failed before. Some battles were worth fighting, even when victory seemed impossible. Some truths were worth speaking, even when no one wanted to hear them. Some choices defined not just your own character, but the kind of world you left for the people who came after you. As Ethan parked outside Sterling Dynamics, and prepared to risk everything one more time. He carried with him the memory of his son's unwavering faith in doing what was right. Whatever happened in the next few hours, Oliver would know that his father had tried to prevent something monstrous from being born. That would have to be enough. The Sterling Dynamics parking garage was busier than usual at 7:30 a.m., filled with luxury vehicles belonging to executives arriving early for the historic signing ceremony. Ethan recognized several cars from his nightly cleaning rounds: Aubrey Barnes' silver Tesla Model S, CTO James Morrison's black BMW, and CFO Patricia Walsh's white Lexus. The presence of numerous vehicles he didn't recognize suggested Nexus Corporation executives had already arrived to finalize the deal. Ethan used his custodial keycard to enter through the service entrance, but instead of taking the freight elevator to the executive floors, he headed for the main lobby. His plan required reaching Aubrey before she became surrounded by colleagues and advisors, which meant intercepting her during her morning routine. According to the patterns he'd observed during 6 months of night shifts, Aubrey always stopped at the executive cafe on the 38th floor before heading to her office. She preferred to review overnight emails and market reports over her first cup of coffee, usually arriving around 8 a.m., and spending 30 minutes alone before her day began in earnest. The executive cafe was a stark contrast to the employee. Break rooms on lower floors, marble countertops, expensive espresso machines, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin. At this hour, it was typically empty, except for catering staff preparing for meetings and the occasional early arriving executive. Ethan positioned himself near the coffee station, ostensibly checking supplies but actually watching the elevator bank for Aubrey's arrival. His custodial uniform provided perfect camouflage. Service workers were effectively invisible to most executives, noticed only when something needed to be cleaned or repaired. At 8:07 a.m., the elevator doors opened, and Aubrey Barnes stepped out, her expression focused and determined. She wore a charcoal gray suit that suggested both authority and approachability, her auburn hair pulled back in a style that was professional but not severe. For someone about to conclude the largest deal in her company's history, she appeared remarkably calm. As she approached the coffee station, Ethan noticed details that his previous glimpses hadn't revealed. The slight tension around her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well. Her movements, while confident, carried an undercurrent of nervous energy. Most tellingly, she was alone. No security detail, no executive assistants, no colleagues offering last-minute advice. "Ms. Barnes?" Ethan stepped forward, his voice carefully modulated to suggest urgency without alarm. She looked up from the espresso machine, her expression shifting from mild surprise to recognition. "Ethan, right? Night shift maintenance. Is there a problem?" "With the building systems?" "Not with the building, ma'am. With the Nexus Corporation deal." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Aubrey's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by the calculating intensity that had made her one of the most feared negotiators in Silicon Valley. "I'm not sure what you think you know about confidential corporate matters, but this conversation needs to end right now. Ma'am, I have documents that show what Nexus really intends to do with your AI technology. You're not selling to a commercial technology company. You're selling to a front operation for government surveillance agencies." Aubrey's hand paused halfway to her coffee cup. "That's a very serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support it?" Ethan pulled out a folder containing the most damning documents he'd discovered. Operation Mirror, a pilot program to test comprehensive behavioral monitoring in 4 major cities using your prediction algorithms. Every citizen in those cities will be tracked, analyzed, and potentially manipulated based on AI assessments of their political reliability. She accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. "Where did you get these documents?" "From your copy center last night. They were cached in the printer memory after being transmitted from Nexus Corporation's legal team." You accessed confidential corporate documents without authorization. That's corporate espionage. Yes, ma'am, it is. But what they're planning is worse than corporate espionage. It's the infrastructure for a surveillance state that would make East Germany look restrained. Aubrey opened the folder and began scanning the documents, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she absorbed the technical specifications and implementation timelines. Ethan watched her face carefully, seeing the moment when the true scope of the plan became clear. "This can't be accurate," she said quietly. "These applications weren't part of our technology transfer discussions because they lied to you. Your CTO, James Morrison, admitted last night that they've been withholding information about Nexus's real intentions. He said you were too naive about implementation realities to understand the larger vision." The personal insult hit its mark. Aubrey's eyes flashed with anger, but her voice remained controlled. "Morrison said that? He said you believe your algorithms will be used for benevolent purposes because that's what you want to believe. He said they were protecting you from information that would compromise your ability to focus on technical aspects. Son of a bitch." The profanity slipped out before she could stop it, revealing the depth of her fury at being deceived by someone she'd trusted. Ethan pressed his advantage. "Miss Barnes, you have maybe 90 minutes before the signing ceremony begins. Once you sign those documents, your technology becomes property of organizations that view constitutional protections as obstacles to social optimization." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with the kind of focused intensity that had made her legendary in AI development. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from anger to something that looked like grief. "Do you know what it took to build this company?" she asked quietly. 7 years of 18-hour days fighting for funding, proving that a woman could succeed in artificial intelligence development. Every algorithm, every breakthrough, every line of code represents months of work by people who believed we were building something beneficial. You were building something beneficial. They're the ones perverting it. And now you're telling me that everything we've accomplished is about to be turned into a weapon against the very freedoms we thought we were protecting. I'm telling you that you still have time to prevent that from happening." Aubrey closed the folder and met his eyes directly. "What makes you think a night shift janitor understands the technical implications of artificial intelligence surveillance systems?" The question Ethan had been dreading, delivered with surgical precision. His cover was blown anyway. Morrison had made that clear the night before. The only chance of convincing Aubrey to walk away from the deal required him to reveal his true identity and hope that his professional credentials outweighed his reputation as a corporate troublemaker. "Because before I was cleaning your offices, I was Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper, former lead systems architect at Davidson Systems. I specialized in the exact type of behavioral prediction algorithms that Nexus wants to weaponize." Aubrey's expression shifted from skepticism to shock. "Dr. Ethan Cooper, you're the Davidson Systems whistleblower?" "I am. You cost the Department of Homeland Security $40 million and triggered a congressional investigation into domestic surveillance programs. I tried to prevent them from building a surveillance system that violated constitutional protections. They destroyed my career for it, but they didn't stop the program. They just found more creative ways to hide it. And now you're working as a janitor. Now I'm a single father trying to support my son while staying as far away from the tech industry as possible. Unfortunately, the tech industry seems determined to find me." Aubrey studied him with new interest, her analytical mind processing the implications of his revelation. "If you're really Dr. Cooper, then you understand the technical capabilities of the systems described in these documents. I understand them better than anyone except possibly you. I also understand what happens to people who try to expose them. That's why I'm asking you to stop this deal before it's too late, instead of trying to blow the whistle after the damage is done. The board has unanimously approved this acquisition. Our shareholders are expecting a $12 billion transaction. That will secure the company's future for decades. Your shareholders won't benefit from $12 billion if it comes at the cost of living in a surveillance state. Money doesn't buy freedom once you've sold the tools to take it away. Aubrey was quiet for several minutes, alternately studying the documents and staring out the windows at the Austin skyline. Ethan could see her brilliant mind working through the implications, weighing financial security against moral responsibility. Even if I wanted to stop the deal, she finally said, the contracts are already signed by Nexus. My signature is just a formality at this point. Contracts can be broken. Deals can be renegotiated. But once your algorithms are integrated into their surveillance infrastructure, there's no taking them back. Breaking a $12 billion deal would destroy Sterling Dynamics. We've already spent millions in development costs based on the acquisition proceeds. The lawsuits alone would bankrupt us. Ms. Barnes, I lost everything trying to prevent a surveillance program that was a fraction of what they're planning now. My career, my savings, my reputation, all gone. But my son still lives in a free country because enough people believe that some things are worth more than financial security. You think I should sacrifice my company for the sake of principles? I think you should save your company from being turned into something you'll spend the rest of your life regretting. The technology you've created could revolutionize healthcare, education, transportation, all the beneficial applications you originally envisioned. But not if it's owned by people who view human freedom as a bug to be eliminated rather than a feature to be protected. As if summoned by their conversation, the elevator doors opened and James Morrison stepped out, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to alarm as he recognized the documents in Aubrey's hands. Aubrey, what's going on here? Why are you talking to him? I'm learning some very interesting things about our new partners. James, care to explain why you didn't mention that Nexus Corporation plans to use our algorithms for domestic surveillance? Morrison's face went pale. I don't know what lies he's been telling you, but Dr. Cooper is a disgraced corporate saboteur with a documented history of paranoid delusions about government overreach. These documents came from your office, James. Are you claiming they're forgeries? I'm claiming they're taken out of context by someone with an agenda. The applications described in those papers are theoretical implementations, not actual deployment plans. Ethan spoke up before Morrison could continue building his defense. Ms. Barnes, ask him about Operation Mirror. Ask him about the pilot programs in Austin, Seattle, Denver, and Phoenix. Ask him why Mrs. Rodriguez is in the hospital. Who's Mrs. Rodriguez? Aubrey asked. My neighbor. She was assaulted in her apartment this morning by people looking for information about my son. They wanted to make sure I understood the consequences of interfering with today's signing. Morrison's expression shifted to something that looked like panic. Aubrey, we need to go upstairs right now. The Nexus executives are waiting, and this conversation is jeopardizing months of negotiations. James, Aubrey's voice carried the authority that had built a billion-dollar company. I asked you a direct question about Operation Mirror. I'd like an answer. The moment stretched taut with tension as Morrison realized that his deception had been exposed and his options had narrowed to damage control. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the resignation of someone who'd lost a battle he'd thought was already won. The enhanced applications are necessary for national security implementations. You were kept out of those discussions because they required security clearances that would have compromised your ability to focus on the core technology development. In other words, you lied to me. In other words, we protected you from information that wasn't relevant to your role in the project. Aubrey Barnes closed the folder and looked directly at Morrison, her decision crystallizing in real time. James, you're fired. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. As Morrison stammered protests and threats, Aubrey turned to Ethan with an expression that suggested she'd found something worth fighting for. even if it cost her everything she built. Dr. Cooper, I think we need to have a much longer conversation before I sign anything today. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor had been transformed for the signing ceremony. Camera crews positioned themselves for optimal angles, while reporters checked their equipment and reviewed notes about the historic $12 billion acquisition. Nexus Corporation executives occupied one side of the polished conference table, their expressions confident and expectant. Sterling Dynamics board members filled the opposing chairs, reviewing final documents with the satisfied air of people about to become very wealthy. At the head of the table sat two chairs, one for Aubrey Barnes, one for Nexus CEO Jonathan Blackwood, a silver-haired man whose public persona suggested grandfatherly wisdom, but whose corporate history revealed a talent for acquiring promising technologies and weaponizing them for government contracts. The scheduled 10 a.m. signing had been delayed twice, first by 30 minutes, then by another hour. Officially, the delay was attributed to final technical reviews. Unofficially, tension had been building as Aubrey's absence became increasingly difficult to explain. At 11:47 a.m., the boardroom doors opened and Aubrey Barnes entered, followed by Ethan Cooper. The juxtaposition was jarring. The billionaire CEO in her tailored suit walking beside a janitor in work clothes, both carrying folders thick with documentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aubrey announced, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect throughout Silicon Valley. "Before we proceed with today's signing, I need to address some concerns that have come to my attention regarding the true nature of this acquisition." Jonathan Blackwood's expression shifted from confident anticipation to carefully controlled alarm. "Aubrey, I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum for renegotiating terms that have already been finalized." "I'm not here to renegotiate, Jonathan. I'm here to expose the fraud that your organization has perpetrated against Sterling Dynamics and our shareholders." The room erupted in murmurs as board members, executives, and reporters tried to process what they were witnessing. Patricia Walsh, Sterling's CFO, leaned forward with obvious concern. "Aubrey, what are you talking about? We've spent months reviewing every aspect of this deal. We've spent months reviewing what Nexus wanted us to see. Dr. Cooper has uncovered documentation that reveals their true intentions for our AI technology." All eyes turned to Ethan, whose presence in the boardroom defied every protocol of corporate hierarchy. Board member Richard Stevens voiced what everyone was thinking. Who is Dr. Cooper, and why is he in this meeting? Aubrey gestured for Ethan to step forward. Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper is the former lead systems architect at Davidson Systems, a specialist in behavioral prediction algorithms, and the person who discovered that we've been systematically deceived about how our technology will be implemented. Recognition dawned on several faces around the table. The Davidson Systems whistleblowing case had been major news in tech circles, and Dr. Cooper's reputation as both a brilliant engineer and a corporate troublemaker preceded him. Jonathan Blackwood's voice carried a hint of desperation as he attempted damage control. "Ms. Barnes, you're allowing a disgraced former employee with a documented history of paranoid delusions to sabotage the largest acquisition in your company's history." "Mr. Blackwood, I'm allowing a doctor of computer science who specializes in exactly the type of systems you're planning to build to explain what you really intend to do with our algorithms." Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Ladies and gentlemen, Nexus Corporation is not a commercial technology company. They're a front operation for a consortium of government agencies and private military contractors. The $12 billion acquisition of Sterling Dynamics is designed to give them access to Ms. Barnes' behavioral prediction technology for the purpose of building the most comprehensive surveillance system in human history." The room exploded in shocked conversation as Ethan continued. "Operation Mirror is a pilot program that will deploy Sterling's AI algorithms to monitor and analyze the behavior of every citizen in 4 major American cities. Every social media post, every purchase, every movement tracked by security cameras will feed into algorithms designed to identify potential dissidents, predict political affiliations, and recommend intervention strategies to ensure compliance. Board. Member Catherine Liu raised her hand for silence. Dr. Cooper, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support them? Ethan opened his folder and began distributing copies of the classified documents. These are internal Nexus Corporation memos outlining the implementation timeline, technical specifications, and target cities for the surveillance system. They were transmitted to Sterling Dynamics executives yesterday evening. As board members reviewed the documents, their expressions shifted from skepticism to horror. The technical language was unambiguous. This was not theoretical research, but an operational plan for comprehensive social control. Jonathan Blackwood made one final attempt to salvage the situation. These documents are classified materials that Dr. Cooper has illegally obtained and taken out of context. The applications described are hypothetical scenarios for academic research, not deployment plans. Mr. Blackwood, Aubrey's voice carried the cold fury of someone who discovered she'd been systematically betrayed. Are you claiming that Operation Mirror is fictional? I'm claiming that Dr. Cooper's interpretation of these materials is colored by his previous conflicts with government surveillance programs. Ethan stepped forward again. Mr. Blackwood, I've spent 3 years living with the consequences of trying to prevent exactly this type of system from being implemented. I understand the technical capabilities described in these documents better than anyone in this room, except possibly Ms. Barnes. This isn't paranoid interpretation. This is recognition of patterns I've seen before. Sterling's head of legal counsel, David Martinez, raised a crucial question. Even if Dr. Cooper's interpretation is accurate, what are our legal obligations at this point? Contracts have been signed. Shareholders have been promised specific returns, and we've already incurred significant expenses based on the acquisition proceeds. Aubrey had clearly anticipated this challenge. David, I've been reviewing our contract since 8 a.m. this morning. The acquisition agreement includes specific language about the intended use of our technology for commercial artificial intelligence applications. If Nexus Corporation intends to use our algorithms for government surveillance, they've materially misrepresented the nature of the deal. That's a significant legal hurdle to prove, Martinez replied. Nexus could argue that government contracts constitute commercial applications. They could argue that, Ethan interjected, except that their own internal documents explicitly describe the technology transfer as supporting non-commercial national security implementations that require compartmentalized information security to prevent public awareness of operational capabilities. The precision of his legal language surprised several board members. Patricia Walsh asked the obvious question. Dr. Cooper, how do you know so much about contract law? Because the last time I tried to expose a surveillance program, I spent 18 months learning about corporate law while defending myself against charges of espionage and theft of trade secrets. You learn quickly when your freedom depends on understanding the legal implications of whistleblowing. Jonathan Blackwood realized that his carefully constructed acquisition was collapsing and made a desperate final gambit. Ms. Barnes, even if you have concerns about implementation details, walking away from this deal will destroy Sterling Dynamics. You'll face lawsuits from shareholders, creditors, and development partners. Your company won't survive the financial devastation. Mr. Blackwood, Aubrey replied with the confidence of someone who'd made peace with her decision. My company has survived and thrived for 7 years because we've never compromised our core values for the sake of short-term profits. If Sterling Dynamics can't exist without becoming complicit in the destruction of human freedom, then it doesn't deserve to exist. She turned to address the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm formally withdrawing Sterling Dynamics from the Nexus Corporation acquisition. Our technology will not be used to build surveillance systems that violate constitutional protections and human dignity. The boardroom erupted in chaos as cameras rolled and reporters shouted questions. Several board members demanded immediate consultation with legal counsel. Nexus executives began making urgent phone calls while their lawyers frantically reviewed termination clauses. In the midst of the turmoil, Aubrey Barnes approached Ethan Cooper with an expression that suggested she'd found something she hadn't expected to discover. "Dr. Cooper, you've just cost me $12 billion and probably my company. I hope you understand the magnitude of what you've done." "Ms. Barnes, I understand exactly what I've done. The question is whether you'll regret it or whether you'll spend the rest of your life grateful that you didn't become complicit in something monstrous." She studied his face for a long moment, seeing something in his expression that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with artificial intelligence in the first place: the belief that technology could serve humanity rather than control it. "Dr. Cooper, I think we need to discuss what comes next. Because if Sterling Dynamics is going to survive as an independent company, we're going to need people who understand the difference between innovation and oppression." As security guards began escorting increasingly agitated Nexus executives from the building, Ethan realized that the most dangerous part of their confrontation was just beginning. They'd prevented one surveillance system from being implemented, but they'd also made enemies of people with vast resources and no scruples about using them. The real test wouldn't be whether they could stop a $12 billion deal, it would be whether they could survive the consequences of standing up to people who viewed human freedom as an obstacle to be eliminated, rather than a value to be protected. Within 6 hours of Aubrey Barnes' announcement, the full weight of corporate and government retaliation descended upon both her and Ethan with surgical precision. The first strike came through Sterling Dynamics' board of directors, who called an emergency session to remove Aubrey as CEO for reckless endangerment of shareholder interests and violation of fiduciary duties. The vote was swift and brutal, 7-2 in favor of immediate termination, with only Catherine Liu and David Martinez supporting Aubrey's decision. Richard Stevens, the board chairman and longtime family friend, delivered the verdict with obvious reluctance. "Aubrey, you've built something remarkable here, but walking away from $12 billion based on the word of a disgraced janitor constitutes gross negligence. The board has no choice but to protect Sterling Dynamics from further damage." "Dick, you've seen the documents. You know what Nexus really intended to do with our technology. I've seen allegations from someone with a documented history of corporate sabotage. What I haven't seen is any consideration for the thousands of employees who will lose their jobs when Sterling Dynamics declares bankruptcy." The second strike targeted Ethan directly. Federal agents arrived at his apartment complex with warrants for his arrest on charges of corporate espionage, theft of classified materials, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Mrs. Rodriguez, still recovering from her injuries, watched from her window as they searched his empty apartment. But the most devastating blow came through Oliver. Sarah called Ethan's burner phone with barely controlled panic in her voice. "They filed papers claiming you're an unfit parent. Child Protective Services is demanding immediate custody transfer based on allegations that you've endangered Oliver through criminal activities and unstable behavior." The symmetry was perfect and vicious. Aubrey Barnes, stripped of her company and facing personal bankruptcy as Sterling's new leadership prepared to blame her for all acquisition-related losses. Ethan Cooper, fugitive from federal charges and fighting to retain custody of his son. Both of them destroyed professionally and personally for the crime of preventing a surveillance system that would have monitored every American citizen. Yet as they met that evening in a downtown Austin coffee shop, two people with nothing left to lose, neither seemed broken by the day's devastation. "They're very good at this," Aubrey observed, stirring sugar into her coffee with steady hands. Complete destruction delivered through entirely legal channels. It's the same playbook they used after Davidson Systems, Ethan replied. Discredit the messenger, criminalize the disclosure, destroy any platform they might use to continue fighting. Except, this time we stopped them before they got what they wanted. This time, yes. But Nexus will find another AI company to acquire, another technology to weaponize. We've won a battle, not the war. Aubrey smiled for the first time since the morning's revelations. Dr. Cooper, you seem to be laboring under the misconception that today was the end of something. I prefer to think of it as the beginning. She slid a folder across the table. I've been making some calls since the board meeting. It turns out there are quite a few AI researchers who've been wondering what happened to Dr. Ethan Mitchell Cooper. Several of them are very interested in working for someone who prioritizes human welfare over government contracts. Ethan opened the folder to find preliminary incorporation papers for a new company, Ethical AI Solutions, with Aubrey Barnes listed as CEO and Dr. Ethan Cooper as Chief Technology Officer. Ms. Barnes were both about to be bankrupted by lawsuits and destroyed by federal investigations. This isn't exactly the ideal time to start a business. Dr. Cooper, sometimes the only way to win is to change the game entirely. They can destroy Sterling Dynamics and prosecute us individually, but they can't stop the ideas we represent. There are too many brilliant people who understand that artificial intelligence should serve humanity, not control it. As federal agents continued searching for Ethan and Sterling's board, prepared to sue Aubrey into oblivion, the two people who'd sacrificed everything to prevent a surveillance state began planning something unprecedented. An AI company that would publicly commit to never accepting government surveillance contracts, never building systems designed to manipulate human behavior, and never prioritizing profit over human freedom. It was audacious, idealistic, and probably doomed to failure. It was also the only choice that allowed them to sleep at night. 18 months after the Sterling Dynamics boardroom confrontation that destroyed their old lives, Ethan Cooper stood in the gleaming headquarters of Ethical AI Solutions, watching his son Oliver demonstrate their latest breakthrough to a room full of venture capitalists. The 14-year-old had inherited more than his father's analytical mind. He'd also developed an intuitive understanding of how artificial intelligence could enhance human potential rather than restrict it. The beauty of our approach, Oliver explained with the confidence of someone who'd grown up understanding both the promise and perils of AI technology, is that the algorithms are designed to empower individual choice rather than predict and control behavior. Users maintain complete ownership of their data and can see exactly how the AI reaches its recommendations. Aubrey Barnes, now CEO of a company worth $400 million and growing, smiled as the investors peppered Oliver with questions. The boy's presentation was polished but authentic, reflecting the values that had guided Ethical AI Solutions from its founding: transparency, accountability, and unwavering commitment to human autonomy. The federal charges against Ethan had been quietly dropped after a congressional investigation revealed the scope of Operation Mirror and the illegal surveillance programs it would have enabled. Mrs. Rodriguez's testimony about the intimidation tactics used against civilian witnesses had triggered a Justice Department review that ultimately vindicated both Ethan's warnings and his methods of exposing them. Sterling Dynamics had indeed declared bankruptcy, but not before the new leadership's desperate attempt to resurrect the Nexus deal was blocked by regulatory authorities. The company's AI technology was eventually acquired by a consortium of universities committed to beneficial applications, ensuring that Aubrey's innovations would serve their original humanitarian purposes. "Dad," Oliver said after the investors had left, "Ms. Patterson wants to know if you'll speak at the high school science fair again next month. She says your talk about ethical technology development was the most popular presentation they've ever had." Ethan nodded, still amazed by how completely their lives had transformed. Oliver thrived in Austin's top-rated public schools, his health insurance covered by a company that valued both technical excellence and moral integrity. The cramped apartment had been replaced by a modest house near Zilker Park, where Oliver could ride his bike and Ethan could sleep without worrying about federal agents or corporate retaliation. "I think we can manage that," he replied, watching Aubrey review financial projections that showed their ethical approach to AI. Development was not only morally sound but remarkably profitable. The surveillance state they'd fought to prevent had been permanently derailed, replaced by a national conversation about the proper role of artificial intelligence in democratic society. Sometimes, Ethan reflected, the most valuable victories were measured not in billions of dollars, but in freedoms preserved and futures protected. As they prepared to leave the office, Aubrey paused to look at the framed photo on her desk. 3 figures standing beside a garden, smiling under an impossibly bright sun. Oliver had drawn it during their first month as a makeshift family, and it remained her favorite reminder of what they'd built together from the ashes of their former lives. They'd lost everything they thought mattered, and discovered something far more valuable: the knowledge that some principles were worth any sacrifice, and that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, sometimes led to rewards beyond imagination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.